Why were thousands of Americans taken to secret underground facilities? The first whispers started subtly, barely noticeable amidst the usual noise of the 24-hour news cycle. Anomalous atmospheric readings in obscure corners of the globe, rapid deployment exercises by various military branches that seemed unusually widespread and urgent, cryptic warnings from government agencies about preparedness, not for a hurricane or earthquake, but something less defined, more insidious. Public health advisories shifted from seasonal flu to discussions of novel pathogens and airborne contaminants with alarming speed, though official statements remained deliberately vague, emphasizing caution and vigilance without specifying a concrete threat. Then came the specialized alerts, disseminated not through general broadcasts, but targeted channels, specific demographics, individuals in certain professions, residents of particular geographic zones receiving encrypted emails, coded text messages, or even direct, unannounced visits from uniformed or plainclothes personnel. My own notification arrived disguised as an urgent recall notice for a niche technical certification, citing a discrepancy that required immediate in-person validation at an off-site location not listed on any public registry. Suspicion gnawed, but the credential was essential for my work, and the notice bore authentic-looking seals and signatures. I wasn't alone. Colleagues received similar, equally perplexing summonses disguised as tax audits, jury duty reschedulings, or mandatory health screenings. The common thread was the urgency and the directive to report to unusual, often remote, locations. The instructions were precise. Pack a single small bag with essentials, medications, a few changes of clothes, important documents, and be ready for transport within hours of receiving the notification. No pets, no excess luggage, and absolute discretion. Questions were met with polite but firm redirection. Details would be provided upon arrival. The designated pickup point for me was a nondescript industrial complex on the outskirts of the city, an area I'd driven past countless times without ever giving it a second thought. Arriving there, I found myself among dozens, then hundreds of others, all carrying similar small bags, faces a mixture of confusion, anxiety, and hesitant curiosity. There were engineers, doctors, scientists, teachers, skilled tradespeople, programmers, young families with bewildered children, and older individuals appearing frail but determined. No general population, it seemed, but a curated assembly. Uniformed personnel, wearing insignia I didn't immediately recognize, not standard military branches, but something more specialized, perhaps a joint task force or a newly formed agency, moved among us, directing individuals into large unmarked buses with tinted windows. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Where were we going? Why us? What was happening? The buses were quiet, save for the hushed murmurs of passengers and the low drone of the engine. Guards sat at the front and rear, armed but not overtly threatening, their expressions impassive. Electronic devices were collected for safekeeping: phones, laptops, tablets. Arguments or resistance were met with calm authority, and the quiet assertion that this was a mandatory relocation under emergency protocols. Looking out the window offered no comfort. The route quickly diverted from familiar roads onto highways that led away from urban centers, deeper into rural landscapes, eventually transitioning onto unpaved roads winding through sparsely populated areas. The journey took hours, stretching into the night. There were no stops, no breaks. Food and water were distributed from sealed packages, sterile and functional. The lack of information was perhaps the most unnerving aspect. Every attempt to solicit details from the personnel was met with the same rehearsed responses about safety, temporary relocation, and the need for cooperation during an unspecified national emergency. As dawn approached, the landscape outside became increasingly desolate. The bus finally slowed, turning off the road towards what looked like an abandoned quarry or a disused mining operation. High fences, barbed wire, and guard towers came into view. Not typical for a civilian relocation center, the gates were massive, reinforced steel, guarded by more of the specialized personnel and heavily armored vehicles. The bus stopped inside a large, covered depot area, brightly lit, but claustrophobic. We were instructed to disembark in small groups. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of damp earth and concrete. Inside the depot, the process became more structured, though still bewildering. We were ushered into a series of temporary processing stations set up within what looked like cavernous industrial spaces. Identification was checked against lists, biometric data collected, fingerprints, retinal scans. Medical personnel performed quick, superficial health checks. Our small bags were x-rayed and briefly searched. The efficiency was chilling, suggesting a plan executed with military precision and years of preparation. There were no signs of hasty improvisation. The personnel conducting the processing maintained an air of professional detachment, answering questions with minimal information, focusing solely on the immediate task. They referred to our destination as the facility, or the secure zone. The scale of the operation became apparent as more buses arrived, disgorging hundreds, then thousands of individuals like myself, all processed through similar channels. The soundscape of the depot was a low hum of machinery, quiet footsteps, and the murmuring of the assembled people, punctuated by the clipped commands of the personnel. The feeling of being part of something enormous, unseen, and entirely beyond individual control was overwhelming. We were being moved, catalogued, and directed like pieces on a massive, complex chessboard, the rules and objective of which were unknown to the players. The initial confusion began to crystallize into a growing sense of unease, bordering on fear. This was no temporary shelter from a storm. This was something else entirely. After processing, we were directed towards another, smaller vehicle waiting further inside the depot. An elevator, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was massive, capable of holding dozens of people and their luggage, with thick steel walls and a door that sealed with a heavy, airtight thud. An official, dressed in the same uniform but with slightly different insignia, addressed our group before we entered. His voice was calm, authoritative, amplified slightly by a portable speaker. He explained that due to an unprecedented atmospheric event, the surface environment in populated areas was becoming hazardous, potentially for an extended period. The facilities we were being taken to were part of a long-standing, highly classified national continuity plan designed to preserve essential personnel and skills necessary for eventual recovery and rebuilding. Our selection, he stated, was based on criteria related to our professions and perceived ability to contribute to long-term survival and societal reconstruction. He stressed the need for order, cooperation, and adherence to facility protocols, stating that our safety and the success of the mission depended on it. His words, delivered with an almost clinical lack of emotion, provided the first official explanation, however sparse. An unprecedented atmospheric event. Hazardous surface environment. National continuity plan. The pieces began to fit, albeit into a terrifying puzzle. This wasn't about a virus or a localized disaster. It was something affecting the air itself. Something widespread and persistent enough to necessitate deep underground relocation for thousands of people deemed vital. The implication was clear. The world outside, as we knew it, was no longer safe, possibly for a long time. Stepping into the massive elevator felt like entering a different world. The doors sealed shut, and with a low vibration and a gentle lurch, we began to descend. The sense of depth was palpable, the descent lasting several minutes, far longer than any conventional elevator ride. The air inside the elevator was cool and dry, artificially circulated. The faces of the people around me reflected a mixture of dawning horror, resignation, and a fragile hope that the officials' words, though alarming, offered a path to survival. The descent was a point of no return, severing the last tangible link to the life we had known just hours before. The destination was unknown, the duration uncertain, but the reality was now undeniable. We were part of a mass relocation to secret underground facilities, the surface world left behind to face an unseen threat. The hum of the elevator was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat pulling us deeper into the earth and away from whatever crisis raged above. The feeling was one of profound isolation, separated from everything familiar by tons of rock and soil, thrust into a future whose contours were entirely unknown. The descent seemed interminable, a slow, steady drop into the Earth's crust. The air pressure shifted subtly, a faint popping in the ears, confirming the significant depth we were reaching. When the massive elevator finally hissed to a stop, the doors opened not into a conventional underground station, but into a vast, brightly lit chamber carved directly from rock. The sheer scale of the space was breathtaking. A cavernous area stretching further than the eye could easily discern, illuminated by powerful artificial light that mimicked daylight, albeit with a slightly sterile cast. The air here was different again, cooler, with a faint metallic tang and the constant low thrum of ventilation systems. We stepped out of the elevator into an assembly area where more personnel in the same specialized uniforms waited, directing us towards another stage of processing. The efficiency was still paramount. There was no waiting, no confusion about where to go. It was a finely tuned machine, processing human beings. This phase involved more detailed identification and assignment. We were given temporary identification cards with magnetic stripes and embedded chips. Our professions and skills were cross-referenced with databases. Then came the assignments, not just to a living space, but to specific sectors or zones within the facility. A man next to me who had mentioned being a chemical engineer was directed towards one corridor. A woman who was a pediatrician was sent down another. I, with my background in technical infrastructure and data management, was assigned to Sector 7. The official who handed me my temporary ID card offered a brief, generic explanation. Your skills are needed in this sector. Follow the blue line on the floor. The blue line, painted clearly on the polished concrete floor, led away from the processing area into a network of wide corridors branching off into the distance. The corridors were immaculate, lined with smooth, prefabricated panels, interspersed with heavy, airtight doors marked with numerical and alphabetical designations. The lighting was consistent, and the air felt clean, filtered, entirely artificial. The lack of natural elements, no windows, no organic textures, no sounds of nature, was profoundly disorienting. It felt less like a shelter and more like a scientific research base or a command center built on an unimaginable scale. Following the blue line, I passed countless identical doors, each marked with codes like Sector 7A, Sector 7B, and so on. The corridors hummed with activity, personnel moving purposefully, small electric utility vehicles gliding silently along designated lanes, the distant sound of machinery that suggested massive operations underway deeper within the facility. Other new arrivals, following their own colored lines, were visible in adjacent corridors or disappearing through marked doorways. There was a palpable sense of purpose among the facility staff, a mission-driven focus that contrasted sharply with the bewildered uncertainty of the new residents. They were polite but distant, answering direct questions only if they pertained to immediate navigation or procedure. Anything related to the outside world, the crisis, or the overall plan was met with the standard response. Information will be provided through official channels at the appropriate time. This enforced ignorance amplified the feeling of being isolated and controlled. My blue line eventually led me to a door marked Sector 7 Residential. Inside was a more conventional-looking area, though still deep underground. It was a large dormitory-style section with long hallways branching off a central communal space. The communal area contained tables, chairs, and what looked like dispensers for food and drink. The hallways were lined with doors, smaller and less robust than the heavy external doors marked with room numbers. I was assigned to room 7R34. The room was Spartan but functional. 2 sets of bunk beds, 4 small lockers, a simple table and chairs. The walls were plain, the lighting fluorescent. There were no personal touches, no windows, of course. It felt sterile, temporary, yet the structure suggested permanence. 2 other individuals were already in the room, unpacking the contents of their small bags into the lockers. We exchanged hesitant greetings, introducing ourselves by first names, sharing fragments of our stories, the cryptic summons, the bewildering journey. One was a software engineer, the other a logistics analyst. Our skills aligned with the technical theme of Sector 7. Later that day, we were gathered in the communal area for an orientation session. An official, clearly in a supervisory role, addressed our group. He reiterated the points made during the elevator descent, the unprecedented atmospheric event, the hazardous surface conditions, the facility's role in preserving essential skills for future recovery. He elaborated slightly on the facility's structure, explaining that it was divided into multiple sectors, each focused on a different critical function: technical infrastructure, medical care, agriculture, implying underground food production, research and development, security, etc. Our sector, Sector 7, was primarily focused on maintaining and operating the facility's complex technical systems, including power generation, life support, communications, internal presumably, and data processing. He explained the basic rules: adherence to schedules for meals and work assignments, no unauthorized movement between sectors, respect for facility personnel and fellow residents. He introduced the concept of work assignments, stating that everyone capable would be expected to contribute to the facility's operations based on their skills. This wasn't a passive refuge. It was a functional community with a critical mission. The scale of the operation was still difficult to grasp. How many people were here? How large was this facility? The corridors seemed to stretch for miles, the different sectors implying a vast interconnected complex. The official mentioned that similar facilities existed in other parts of the country, part of a coordinated national effort. Thousands of Americans deemed essential for various functions had been relocated underground. The sheer logistical and engineering challenge of building and operating such a network of facilities, capable of sustaining large populations deep underground, was staggering. It spoke of decades of secret planning and investment, an infrastructure hidden beneath the surface, waiting for an unimaginable crisis. The unprecedented atmospheric event remained undefined, adding another layer of fear and uncertainty. Was it a natural phenomenon? A solar flare? A shift in the planet's atmosphere? Or was it something man-made? A weapon? An environmental catastrophe triggered by human action? The lack of specific details fueled speculation and rumors among the residents. The first night underground was a strange experience. The artificial lighting remained constant, though dimmed slightly in the residential areas during designated sleep cycles. The air was perpetually circulated, the temperature regulated, creating an environment that felt entirely disconnected from the natural world. Sleep came fitfully, disturbed by the low hum of machinery that seemed to permeate everything, and the unsettling awareness of tons of earth and rock pressing down from above. The silence of nature was absent, replaced by the controlled sounds of a manufactured environment. Dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with images of the world left behind, now shrouded in mystery and danger. The reality of our situation settled in with the darkness, or rather, the artificial dimming. We were underground, isolated, our lives entirely dependent on the complex systems humming around us and the people who controlled them. The question of why was beginning to be answered piece by piece, but the implications of that answer were profound and terrifying. We were survivors of something catastrophic, chosen for reasons we were only beginning to understand, confined to a hidden world beneath the surface of America. The first few days underground blurred into a routine of sorts, structured entirely by the facility's schedule. Wake-up was signaled not by sunlight, but by the artificial lights brightening, and a gentle chime over the internal communication system. Meals were served in the communal areas at set times, dispensed from automated units, nutritious, bland, and consistent. The food was clearly designed for sustenance and efficiency, likely produced within the facility's own agricultural sector, if the officials' words were accurate. After meals came the work assignments. My background in technical infrastructure led me to a team responsible for monitoring and maintaining the vast network of servers, cables, and systems that managed communication, data storage, and control functions throughout Sector 7 and possibly beyond. The scale of the technical infrastructure was immense, far exceeding what I had encountered in the corporate world. It was clear this facility was a self-contained digital ecosystem designed to operate independently for an extended period. My colleagues in Sector 7 were a diverse group of IT professionals, data scientists, network engineers, and system administrators, all brought together by the same cryptic summons and bewildering journey. We worked in large, air-conditioned server rooms and control centers, the heart of the facility's digital operations. The tasks were complex and demanding, requiring concentration and skill. This was clearly part of the plan, keeping essential personnel occupied and contributing, preventing idleness and focusing minds on tangible problems rather than existential dread. The facility personnel overseeing our work were knowledgeable in their respective fields, indicating they were not just guards or administrators, but operational specialists integrated into the facility's core functions. They provided instructions, access to systems, and answered technical questions, but remained tight-lipped about anything beyond the scope of our immediate tasks. During breaks, conversations among the residents inevitably circled back to the same questions. What exactly was the atmospheric event? How bad was it on the surface? How long would we be here? Rumors spread quickly through the limited channels available. Hushed conversations in the residential areas, whispers during work assignments, snippets overheard from less guarded personnel. Some speculated it was a hypertoxic airborne virus resistant to UV light, requiring underground isolation. Others suggested a catastrophic solar flare that had stripped away a layer of the atmosphere, exposing the surface to lethal radiation. Another popular theory involved industrial accidents on a global scale or even a targeted environmental weapon. Without official, verifiable information, these theories flourished, each more unsettling than the last. The facility staff neither confirmed nor denied any specific rumors, simply reiterating that the surface was currently hazardous and the facility provided the safest environment. The psychological impact of confinement and uncertainty began to manifest in various ways. Some individuals became withdrawn and quiet, spending their free time alone in their rooms. Others became overly anxious, constantly seeking information or expressing fears about loved ones left behind on the surface. Small conflicts arose over minor things: space in the communal area, access to laundry facilities, perceived unfairness in work assignments, fueled by the underlying stress and lack of control. The facility personnel maintained order firmly, but usually without resorting to harsh measures, intervening quickly to de-escalate situations and reminding everyone of the importance of cooperation for the survival of the community. There were designated areas for recreation, a small gym with exercise equipment, rooms with books, mostly technical manuals or classic literature, little contemporary fiction, and spaces for quiet contemplation, though these areas were also stark and functional, lacking any attempt at creating a comfortable or inviting atmosphere. We learned more about the facility's scale through casual observation and fragments of information gleaned from our work. The technical systems we monitored served not just Sector 7 but seemed to extend throughout the entire complex, managing power distribution, environmental controls, communication networks, and security systems for multiple sectors. It was a self-contained world, powered by what appeared to be a geothermal or perhaps even a small nuclear power source, given the consistent, abundant energy supply. The air circulation system was incredibly complex, constantly filtering and recycling the air, maintaining a stable temperature and humidity. Water seemed to be sourced from a deep underground aquifer and purified through a multi-stage process. Everything was engineered for long-term independent operation. The scale was mind-boggling. Estimates whispered among the residents put the total population within this single facility in the tens of thousands, perhaps even higher. And this was just one facility, part of a national network. Access between sectors was strictly controlled. Heavy sealed doors separated different zones, requiring specific clearance cards or biometric scans to open. Unauthorized movement was a serious breach of protocol, met with swift intervention by the security personnel, who were visibly more numerous and heavily armed than the operational staff. These security personnel were distinct from the other staff, often wearing different uniforms and maintaining a constant watchful presence. Their role was clearly to ensure the integrity and security of the facility, both internally and presumably from any potential external threats, though the nature of the surface threat made an external breach seem unlikely. This strict control over movement reinforced the feeling of being contained, not just protected. We were not free to roam. We were confined to our designated areas and work zones, our movements dictated by the facility's operational needs and security protocols. The routine, while providing a semblance of normalcy, also highlighted the artificiality of our existence. Days and nights were marked by the dimming and brightening of lights, not the rise and fall of the sun. The air never changed. There were no breezes, no smells of rain or earth. Food was always the same, textures and flavors repetitive. The only sounds were mechanical, the hum of systems, the distant clank of machinery, the quiet footsteps in the corridors. The lack of sensory input from the natural world was profound, leading to a strange sense of detachment from the passage of time and the world we had left behind. We were living in a bubble, a perfectly controlled environment, waiting for a signal that might never come, a signal indicating that the surface world was safe again. The silence from the outside was absolute. There were no external communication channels accessible to residents, no news broadcasts, no internet, No contact with anyone not within the facility. We were effectively sealed off, our fate entirely in the hands of the personnel who ran this hidden world and the conditions prevailing on the surface, about which we knew precious little concrete information. The third part of our subterranean existence was defined by this enforced routine, the constant work, the quiet anxieties, and the slow, unsettling realization of the true scale and purpose of the underground world we now inhabited. It was a world built for survival, yes, but also for control, a world where the rules were absolute and the reasons often obscured. Life settled into a rhythm, dictated by the facility's internal clock and the demands of our work assignments. For those of us in Sector 7, the focus remained on maintaining the digital and technical backbone of the complex. This involved everything from routine system checks and software updates to troubleshooting glitches in communication lines between sectors and ensuring the integrity of the vast data archives stored deep within the facility's servers. These archives were tantalizingly vast, containing not just technical data related to the facility's operation, but also massive amounts of information about the surface world prior to our relocation. Databases of individuals, records of infrastructure, scientific reports, cultural archives. Access to these archives was restricted based on clearance levels, and our team had only limited access to specific data sets required for our work. However, the sheer volume of information hinted at the comprehensive nature of the contingency plan. It wasn't just about preserving people, but about preserving knowledge and the infrastructure needed to rebuild society. The nature of the unprecedented atmospheric event remained officially unconfirmed, but the details we could piece together from fragmented discussions among technical personnel or from the limited data we were allowed to access within specific parameters of our jobs painted a grim picture. There were references to atmospheric destabilization, elevated radiation signatures, and persistent airborne contaminants. Some technical documents mentioned the breakdown of certain protective layers in the upper atmosphere, possibly triggered by an extreme solar event or a chain reaction from terrestrial sources, leading to increased exposure to harmful radiation and the inability of the atmosphere to disperse or neutralize pollutants effectively. This would render the surface environment hazardous to human life for potentially decades or even centuries, depending on the scale of the breakdown and the time required for natural processes to regenerate the atmosphere or for contaminants to decay. The need for deep underground facilities capable of generating their own breathable air and shielding inhabitants from external radiation and contamination suddenly became terrifyingly clear. The facility itself was a marvel of engineering, confirming the whispers of decades of secret planning. The walls of the corridors and chambers were thick, clearly designed for maximum shielding. The air filtration systems were multi-layered and redundant, constantly monitoring air quality and removing even the smallest particulate matter. The power generation system was robust, providing seemingly unlimited energy. Water and waste management systems were entirely self-contained, recycling resources with incredible efficiency. There were even indications of advanced biological systems, possibly for waste processing or supplementing air regeneration, operating in restricted areas. The entire complex felt like a massive, closed ecological system, designed to sustain life independently of the surface for an indefinite period. This wasn't a temporary shelter, it was a long-term habitat. Interactions with the facility personnel remained professional but formal. There was a clear hierarchy and division of roles. Operational staff managed the day-to-day functions of the facility and oversaw our work. Security personnel maintained order and controlled access. A third group, often seen in different uniforms and with an air of higher authority, seemed to be involved in overall command and control, interacting less with the general resident population and more with sector supervisors and security chiefs. These were the people who held the knowledge, who made the decisions about resource allocation, access to information, and interactions with other potential facilities or the outside world, if any such interaction was still possible. Their briefings to the resident population were rare and carefully controlled, delivering minimal information in reassuring but ultimately non-committal language about the surface situation and the timeline for re-emergence. The psychological toll of indefinite confinement in an artificial environment began to affect everyone. Days bled into weeks, then months. The lack of natural cues for time, no changing seasons, no weather, no sunrise or sunset, distorted the perception of duration. The constant artificial light, even when dimmed, made it difficult for many to maintain natural sleep cycles. Counseling services were available, provided by facility staff who were also relocated residents, offering support for anxiety, depression, and the grief of losing the lives and loved ones left behind. Group therapy sessions became common, providing a space for residents to share their fears and frustrations, to find solidarity in their shared predicament. The question of, what about them? The people who weren't selected, who were left on the surface to face the atmospheric hazard, hung heavy in the air. The official narrative focused solely on the survival of the relocated population, implying that the fate of those left behind was either sealed or beyond the facility's ability to influence. This unspoken truth was perhaps the most difficult to bear for many. Work became a coping mechanism for some, a way to focus energy and attention away from the overwhelming reality of our situation. Others found solace in the limited recreational activities or in forming small, close-knit social groups within their residential sectors. Relationships formed out of shared experience and mutual support. These human connections were vital, providing a sense of community and belonging in an otherwise sterile and controlled environment. However, the underlying tension of confinement and uncertainty was always present, a low hum beneath the surface of daily life, much like the constant mechanical hum of the facility itself. The feeling of being trapped, no matter how well provisioned or safe, was inescapable. Whispers circulated about potential communication with other facilities. Our work in Sector 7 occasionally involved monitoring encrypted data streams that seemed to originate from or be directed towards points outside our immediate network, hinting at the possibility of inter-facility communication. However, the content of these transmissions was heavily encrypted and inaccessible to us. It suggested that the National Continuity Plan involved more than just isolated bunkers. It was a distributed network, potentially coordinating efforts across the country or even globally, though this remained speculative. The nature of this coordination, the status of other facilities, and the overall picture of the post-event world were secrets held tightly by the command personnel. We were cogs in a massive machine, kept operational but largely uninformed about the machine's overall purpose and direction. As the months turned into what felt like an endless cycle of artificial days, the question of re-emergence became a constant topic of discussion. Would the surface ever be safe again? Were the atmospheric conditions improving, stabilizing, or worsening? The command personnel offered no timeline, only assurances that monitoring was ongoing and that re-emergence would only occur when conditions were deemed safe for long-term human habitation. This lack of a concrete endpoint was a significant source of stress and anxiety. We were living in limbo, our futures entirely dependent on environmental factors beyond our control and the decisions of a small group of individuals who held all the information. The underground world, initially a perceived sanctuary, began to feel increasingly like a permanent state of existence, a new reality from which escape or return seemed less and less likely with each passing cycle. The true nature of our captivity, however benevolent its intent, was becoming starkly apparent. We were the preserved, the chosen, the seeds of a future society, held in stasis beneath the earth, waiting for a world that might never return to its former state. The internal structure of the facility became more familiar with time, though certain areas remained strictly off-limits. We learned that the sectors were physically separated by multiple layers of security doors and checkpoints, designed to contain potential issues within one zone, like a contamination breach or a technical failure, and prevent them from spreading. Sector 1, we heard, was the primary command and control center. Sector 2 housed advanced research laboratories, rumored to be working on atmospheric remediation technologies or biological countermeasures. Sector 3 was the agricultural zone, where artificial light and hydroponic systems were used to grow food. Sector 4 was the medical sector, equipped with extensive facilities and staffed by the relocated doctors, nurses, and specialists. Sectors 5 and 6 were dedicated to infrastructure maintenance, power generation, and environmental control systems. Our sector, Sector 7, handled all technical, communication, and data aspects. Sector 8 was the primary security hub and potentially contained additional residential or holding areas. The scale and complexity were staggering, a testament to the resources and foresight, or paranoia, that had gone into its creation. Rumors continued to circulate, now incorporating more detailed, though still unverified, information about the facility's operations and the outside world. Some residents working in food production in Sector 3 whispered about experiments with genetically modified crops designed to tolerate harsh environmental conditions, suggesting the command staff was planning for a surface environment that would be drastically different from the one we left. Those in the medical sector heard discussions of long-term health effects of radiation exposure and airborne toxins, reinforcing the severity of the atmospheric hazard. In our technical sector, we occasionally encountered data logs referencing automated probes sent to the surface, gathering atmospheric samples and environmental data. The readings were consistently negative, indicating conditions remained hostile. But the fact that probes were being sent at all offered a faint glimmer of hope that monitoring and planning for re-emergence were active processes. The monotony of the underground existence was occasionally broken by internal events. There were scheduled assemblies in large auditoriums, where command personnel delivered updates, often vague and filled with technical jargon, but providing some official interaction. These events were carefully managed, with security personnel present and limited opportunities for residents to ask questions, reinforcing the top-down control structure. There were also occasional social events, gatherings in the communal areas with slightly better food and permitted internal facility music broadcasts, attempts to boost morale and create a sense of community beyond the work assignments. These felt forced and artificial, highlighting rather than alleviating the underlying tension and sense of confinement. The most significant events were medical emergencies or, tragically, deaths among the residents. Despite the controlled environment, people still fell ill or succumbed to pre-existing conditions. The facility had a morgue and protocols for handling deaths, clinical and efficient. Another stark reminder that even in this engineered sanctuary, life and death continued, stripped of the rituals and comforts of the world above. The command personnel, particularly those in the highest leadership roles, remained enigmatic figures, rarely interacting directly with the general population. They were the architects of this underground society, the ones who possessed the full picture of the crisis and the plan. Speculation about their backgrounds was rife. Were they military leaders, government officials, brilliant scientists who had foreseen this event? Their authority was absolute within the facility, their decisions shaping every aspect of our lives. While their existence implied a guiding hand and a strategic purpose, their remoteness also fostered a sense of detachment and distrust. We were dependent on them for our survival, but we knew them only through their directives and the occasional formal briefing. The duration of our confinement stretched from months into a year. then longer. The initial hope for a quick return to the surface began to wane, replaced by a growing acceptance that this might be our reality for a very long time, perhaps permanently. Children born underground knew no other world, their first steps taken on polished concrete, their sky the artificial glow of fluorescent lights. Education programs were established, taught by the relocated teachers, using the facility's extensive digital archives as curriculum material. Life continued, adapting to the confines of the underground world. Relationships deepened, families formed. A new generation was growing up with no memory of sunlight or open air. The psychological evolution of the resident population was a complex process. Initial shock and anxiety gave way to adaptation and resignation for many. Some found purpose and satisfaction in their work, contributing to the survival of the community. Others struggled with depression, claustrophobia, and the pervasive sense of loss. The facility's psychological support staff worked tirelessly to address these issues, recognizing that the mental health of the population was as critical to long-term survival as the functioning of the life support systems. Therapy sessions explored themes of grief, acceptance, finding meaning in the present, and navigating a future stripped of familiar landmarks. The most significant internal challenge was maintaining social cohesion in a confined, stressful environment. While the facility provided security and resources, it was also a controlled society with inherent inequalities in knowledge and freedom. The residents, a diverse group brought together by circumstance, had to learn to coexist and cooperate. While major conflicts were prevented by security, minor tensions and frustrations were common. The shared predicament fostered a sense of solidarity among many, a recognition that they were all in this together, dependent on each other for community and support. Yet the constant reminder of the world lost, the uncertainty of the future, and the subtle control exercised by the facility staff created an undercurrent of anxiety that was never far from the surface of this underground world. The fourth part of our story was one of adaptation, the forging of a new, albeit artificial, existence deep beneath the earth, marked by routine, work, hidden fears, and the slow, difficult process of coming to terms with the magnitude of what had been lost and the profound uncertainty of what lay ahead. The question of how long we would remain underground became the central, unspoken concern. The official line from command remained consistently vague. Monitoring continues. Conditions are not yet suitable for re-emergence. This lack of a specific timeline fueled anxieties and led residents to search for any clues within the limited information available or through observation of facility operations. Those working in the environmental monitoring sections of Sector 7 reported that while certain high-level radiation readings near the surface access points had decreased marginally over long periods, the levels of persistent airborne contaminants remained dangerously high. These substances, the specific nature of which was never fully disclosed to the general resident population, seemed resistant to natural degradation processes or atmospheric dispersion. Their presence, combined with potential ongoing atmospheric instability, meant the surface environment was still lethal for unprotected human life. The facility's infrastructure continued to operate with remarkable efficiency, a testament to its design and the dedication of the personnel maintaining it. The agricultural sector, Sector 3, was reportedly expanding its operations, utilizing increasingly sophisticated hydroponic and potentially aeroponic systems to grow a wider variety of crops. This expansion, coupled with the long-term nature of the medical facilities and the educational programs for children, reinforced the growing belief that the command staff was preparing for a very long stay, possibly multiple generations. The narrative shifted subtly from temporary relocation to long-term habitation, though the word permanent was still carefully avoided in official communications. Within our sector, Sector 7, the focus of work began to shift. While core system maintenance remained essential, resources were increasingly allocated to projects related to surface viability assessment and reconstruction preparedness. This involved analyzing historical data about the surface environment, modeling potential timelines for atmospheric recovery based on the limited probe data, and developing plans for deploying automated systems or even early human teams in heavily shielded gear to conduct initial surveys if conditions ever improved to a marginally safer state. There was also significant work on developing and securing communication protocols, hinting at the possibility of establishing contact with other known facilities or even potential pockets of survivors on the surface, should they exist and be capable of communication. The development of communication capabilities became a source of both hope and frustration. The encrypted data streams we monitored confirmed that communication between facilities was indeed happening, albeit on a highly secure network controlled by command personnel. These transmissions were dense with technical data and operational directives, inaccessible in content to our level of clearance, but their existence proved we were not alone in this subterranean network. The possibility of establishing contact with the surface, however, remained theoretical. The atmospheric conditions were thought to interfere severely with standard radio communications, and any surface-based communication infrastructure had likely been destroyed or rendered inoperable by the atmospheric event. Yet the work on secure protocols suggested that the command staff hadn't entirely given up on the idea of eventually reaching out. The children growing up in the facility presented a unique challenge and a source of profound meaning for the adult residents. They were the future, the generation that would inherit whatever world emerged from this crisis. Their education was comprehensive, encompassing not only standard academic subjects, but also practical skills necessary for survival and reconstruction, drawing heavily on the archived knowledge of the pre-event world. There were lessons on agriculture, engineering, environmental science, and even social structures and history, presented through digital simulations and theoretical exercises. These children were being raised to be the inheritors of a lost world, equipped with the knowledge and skills to potentially rebuild it, should the opportunity ever arise. Their presence added a layer of purpose to the otherwise monotonous existence, a reason to persevere beyond individual survival. As the years passed underground, we kept track of time based on the facility's internal clock and shared knowledge of the calendar year we had left behind. The initial shock and trauma gradually receded for many, replaced by a quiet adaptation to the new normal. The underground facility was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was home, however strange and artificial. The corridors, the communal areas, the work zones, they became familiar, the boundaries of our world. The memory of the surface world became more distant, tinged with nostalgia and a sense of irreality. We remembered the sun, the rain, the feel of grass, the smell of the outside air. But these memories felt increasingly like dreams or stories from a different age. The command personnel occasionally introduced new programs or initiatives, often framed as ways to improve quality of life or prepare for the future. These included opportunities for residents to propose research projects within strict parameters, participate in facility governance committees, advisory roles with no real decision-making power, or engage in cultural activities utilizing the archived resources, movies, music, art reproductions. These initiatives, while seemingly benevolent, also serve to maintain control and provide outlets for resident energy and potential discontent, channeling it into productive or sanctioned activities. The underlying structure of authority remained absolute. While feedback was solicited, ultimate decisions rested solely with the command staff. The relationship between the residents and the facility personnel evolved from one of apprehension to a complex dynamic of mutual dependence and underlying power differential. We relied on them for safety, resources, and information, however limited. They relied on us for the skills and labor necessary to operate and maintain the facility. There was a professional respect born out of shared purpose, but the fundamental imbalance of control and knowledge prevented true equality or intimacy. The personnel were the gatekeepers, the ones who interacted with the higher command and possessed a clearer understanding of the overall situation. The psychological challenges shifted from acute anxiety to chronic low-grade stress, punctuated by periods of deep melancholy or frustration. The loss of autonomy, the lack of privacy, even in the residential rooms we knew we were monitored, albeit discreetly, and the pervasive uncertainty about the future took their toll. Some residents developed routines and coping mechanisms that allowed them to function and even find moments of contentment within the constraints of the underground world. Others struggled, succumbing to despair or experiencing mental health crises that required intervention from the medical sector. The facility provided care, but it was a clinical environment, lacking the warmth and personal connection of the outside world. The fifth part of our subterranean journey was one of deepening adaptation and the quiet struggle for meaning and well-being within the confines of a carefully controlled artificial world built deep within the earth. A world designed for survival but inherently lacking the essential elements of human freedom and connection to nature. The question of the surface remained, a constant, heavy presence. A world we longed for but feared might be irrevocably lost. Years melted into a decade, then more. The children born underground reached adolescence. Their understanding of the surface world based entirely on the stories and data they were given. Their lives were defined by the steel and concrete corridors, the hum of machinery, the artificial light. They were healthy, educated, and adapted to their environment, but fundamentally alien to the concept of an open sky or a natural landscape. For the adults who had lived on the surface, the memories remained, sharp but increasingly overlaid with the reality of the underground. We marked time not by seasons, but by facility milestones, anniversaries of our arrival, the completion of major infrastructure projects, the rare, carefully managed births and deaths. Work in Sector 7 continued, evolving as technology advanced within the facility's closed ecosystem. We were involved in upgrading systems, developing more sophisticated environmental monitoring algorithms, and processing ever-increasing amounts of data from automated probes that continued to venture to the surface. The probe data, analyzed by specialists in Sector 2 and interpreted for us in Sector 7, showed glacial progress in atmospheric recovery. Certain short-lived contaminants had decayed, but the persistent substances and the overall atmospheric instability remained critical hazards. There was no indication that the surface would be habitable without extensive life support for decades, possibly centuries. This reality, though never explicitly stated as a permanent sentence, solidified the understanding that the underground facility was not a temporary shelter, but a multi-generational ark. The command staff began to implement programs focused on long-term societal structures. Governance committees became slightly more empowered, given genuine input, though still advisory, on aspects of daily life, resource allocation within sectors, and community welfare programs. There was an emphasis on training the younger generation for leadership roles within the facility, preparing them to take over the management and operation of the complex in the future. This was a clear signal that the current command staff was planning for succession and a sustained underground civilization. Education curriculum expanded to include civics, ethics, and leadership principles, preparing the next generation not just to survive, but to govern their subterranean world. Cultural life developed within the facility, a blend of salvaged archives and new creations. Residents with artistic talents organized performances, using archived scripts or composing new works reflecting their unique experience. Music, both from the archives and newly created, became an important part of life, providing emotional expression and connection. Small libraries of physical books were established, salvaged from the surface and carefully preserved. These cultural activities, while still confined to designated areas and scheduled times, provided vital outlets for creativity and shared experience, helping to maintain a sense of humanity in the artificial environment. Intersector communication became more frequent, facilitated by the network we maintained in Sector 7. While direct resident-to-resident communication between sectors was still restricted and monitored, operational communication between work teams in different sectors was necessary and common. This allowed for a greater understanding of the facility's interconnectedness and the specific challenges faced by different groups. The difficulties in maintaining yields in the agricultural sector, the complexities of long-term health management in the medical sector, the ongoing efforts in research and development in Sector 2. This shared understanding fostered a sense of collective effort towards a common goal: the sustained survival of the underground community. The psychological landscape of the facility population shifted again. The initial trauma had faded, replaced by a deep-seated acceptance of the underground as reality. However, the lack of variety, the constant artificiality, and the persistent uncertainty about the surface created a new set of challenges. Some residents developed unusual coping mechanisms, fixating on minor details, developing elaborate personal routines, or withdrawing into internal worlds. The counselors and medical staff continued their work, dealing with chronic stress, anxiety, and adjustment disorders. The concept of surface sickness emerged, not a physical illness, but a deep-seated yearning for the natural world, a form of existential homesickness that could be profoundly debilitating. The command staff, while still remote, occasionally engaged in more personal ways, perhaps recognizing the need for human connection and reassurance after so many years. There were rare town hall-style meetings, still heavily moderated, where residents could submit questions in advance, which were then answered by members of the command team. These sessions provided limited information but did offer a sense of transparency, however controlled. We learned about ongoing research projects in Sector 2, efforts to secure new sources of rare earth minerals or other vital resources deep within the earth, and limited, highly risky expeditions to secured surface locations, undertaken by specialized, heavily protected teams, never residents, to retrieve critical equipment or data from pre-positioned caches. The possibility of communication with other facilities became a more concrete reality for those of us in Sector 7 involved in network monitoring. We observed encrypted transmissions increasing in frequency and complexity, suggesting a growing level of coordination across the national network of underground facilities. There were hints of resource sharing, exchange of scientific data, and coordination of surface monitoring efforts. This network represented a distributed survival strategy, a linked series of arcs preserving different segments of the population and different sets of skills. The full scope of this network, the number of facilities, and the total surviving population remained a state secret, but the evidence suggested it was a significant undertaking involving hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, of people across the country. As the years passed, a new generation, born and raised entirely underground, began to enter the workforce, integrated into the operational sectors based on their aptitudes and training. These young adults lacked the visceral memory of the surface world that shaped the perspectives of their parents' generation. For them, the underground facility was the world. The concept of sunlight, rain, and open spaces was abstract, something learned from archives and stories. They were healthy, resilient, and adapted to their environment, possessing the technical skills necessary to maintain and operate the complex infrastructure that sustained them. They represented the successful continuity of the human species, albeit in a vastly different engineered form. The sixth part of our journey was marked by the slow, relentless passage of time, the deepening entrenchment of underground life, the emergence of a new generation, and the growing realization that re-emergence, if it ever happened, would not be a return to the past, but the beginning of something entirely new and profoundly challenging. The underground world had become our home, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, but also a stark reminder of a world lost and a future yet to be determined. Decades passed. The adults who had arrived as young or middle-aged individuals were now entering old age, their bodies accustomed to the artificial environment, their memories of the surface world increasingly distant and dreamlike. The generation born underground were now adults, fully integrated into the operation and governance of the facility. Leadership roles transitioned from the original command staff, many of whom had passed away or retired within the facility, to members of the first and second underground generations, trained for these positions from a young age. The facility became a self-governing, self-sustaining society, albeit one born out of crisis and living in perpetual anticipation of a return to a world it had never truly known. Life in the facility evolved, becoming more nuanced. While the fundamental structure of work assignments and controlled movement remained, the community developed its own traditions, its own social norms, and its own history, the history of the below. There were celebrations marking key anniversaries of the facility's operation, ceremonies honoring those who had contributed significantly or passed away, and cultural festivals that blended archived knowledge with new forms of expression. The children of the third generation, born to parents who had never seen the sun, grew up accepting the underground as the only reality, their understanding of the surface even more abstract than that of their predecessors. Work in Sector 7 focused increasingly on optimizing the facility's long-term efficiency and preparing for eventual, though still undefined, interactions with the surface. We worked on developing more advanced automation systems, artificial intelligence for monitoring complex environmental data, and robust communication protocols for potential long-range signaling. The data from surface probes, sent out periodically from heavily shielded launch points, continued to show gradual atmospheric improvement over immense timescales. Certain persistent contaminants were finally showing signs of breaking down, possibly due to natural processes finally asserting themselves over centuries, or perhaps aided by targeted atmospheric remediation efforts being conducted by other facilities or automated surface systems. However, the environment remained profoundly hostile compared to the pre-event world. Inter-facility communication became a regular, critical part of the network operations. We knew there were many other facilities spread across the country, each preserving a different group of people and a different set of skills. Agricultural specialists in one, manufacturing experts in another, cultural archivists in a third. These facilities formed a distributed network, sharing data, coordinating research, and planning for potential future interactions. The command structure evolved into a distributed council, composed of representatives from different facilities, making decisions collectively regarding research priorities, resource management across the network, and the long-term strategy for potential re-emergence. The scale of this network, the combined population it sustained, represented a significant portion of the pre-event population, preserved and poised, if the surface ever recovered. The concept of re-emergence shifted from an immediate hope to a distant, long-term goal, a mission for future generations. Planning sessions, involving representatives from all sectors, including those in Sector 7 providing data analysis and technical modeling, discussed the immense challenges of returning to a fundamentally altered surface environment. This would involve deploying advanced atmospheric processing technologies, establishing heavily shielded surface habitats, developing new forms of agriculture capable of growing food in potentially contaminated soil, and navigating a landscape whose infrastructure had likely been destroyed and whose natural ecosystems had been irrevocably changed. It would not be a simple return, but a colonization of a changed world, a monumental task requiring coordinated effort across the entire network of facilities. The psychological state of the population reached a complex equilibrium. There was a deep sense of community and shared destiny, forged by generations of living in confinement. The underground world, with its routines and relationships, was home. Yet the knowledge of the world above, the lost world, remained a powerful presence, a source of both longing and apprehension. The surface sickness persisted, a quiet ache for something unknown but intuitively understood as essential to human existence. Therapy and community support focused on finding fulfillment within the underground reality while maintaining a sense of purpose towards the long-term goal of potential re-emergence, however distant. The security protocols remained in place, a constant reminder of the facility's origins in crisis and the need to maintain order and control. While internal tensions arose, particularly between generations or over resource allocation, they were generally managed through established governance channels and community mediation, with security intervention reserved for serious breaches. The facility was a structured society, built on necessity and control, but also on cooperation and the shared will to survive and eventually reclaim something of what was lost. As decades turned into a century, the atmospheric data from surface probes began to show more significant, though still slow, improvement. Certain contaminants had decayed to levels that might, potentially, support limited biological activity in heavily shielded environments. Radiation levels were still elevated but trending downwards over vast periods. The discussion in the Interfacility Command Council shifted from if re-emergence was possible to when and how. Timelines were discussed, measured in decades or even centuries, not years. The planning for the Great Return became the central focus of the underground societies, a monumental undertaking that would define the mission of the current and future generations. The children of the fourth generation, born into a world their great-grandparents had only ever known from archives and filtered stories, began to learn about the surface not just as a lost past, but as a potential future, a mission field for their lives. Their education incorporated specific training for re-emergence, how to operate surface equipment, how to build shielded habitats, how to interact with a potentially hostile environment. The narratives of the underground facilities, initially stories of survival and loss, began to incorporate the theme of hope and reclamation, a long-term mission to heal a wounded planet and rebuild civilization. The seventh part of our story was one of long-term endurance, generational transition, and the slow, difficult shift from mere survival to active, multi-generational planning for a future on a changed surface world. The underground cities had preserved life, but the true test would be whether that life could successfully return to the light. Centuries passed underground. The original residents were long gone, their stories preserved in the facility's archives, their legacy living on in the generations that followed. The concept of the surface was no longer a living memory, but a historical event, a mythological place of origin depicted in salvaged media and facility-produced educational materials. The underground cities had become self-sufficient societies with complex social structures, cultural norms, and political systems that had evolved over generations of confinement. The population had stabilized, adapted to the artificial environment in ways their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. Work in Sector 7 continued, the technology becoming incredibly advanced. We managed systems that were largely automated, controlled by sophisticated AI, monitoring not just the facility's internal environment, but also receiving and processing increasingly detailed data from the surface. The probes were now highly sophisticated, capable of conducting complex chemical analyses, mapping radiation hot zones, and even detecting early signs of biological recovery in heavily contaminated areas. The data, compiled and analyzed across the interfacility network, showed that the atmospheric conditions, after centuries, were finally reaching levels that might, theoretically, support life without continuous, heavy shielding, albeit a different kind of life and a different kind of environment. The Interfacility Command Council, now composed of leaders born and raised underground, made the historic decision. Preliminary re-emergence operations would begin. This was not a mass exodus, but a phased, highly controlled process that would likely span generations. The first phase involved deploying automated construction units and specialized, heavily shielded vehicles to establish small, secure surface outposts near the facility access points. These outposts were essentially hardened bunkers designed to provide a protected environment for initial surface teams and equipment. The data they would collect and the infrastructure they would build would pave the way for subsequent phases. Selecting the first surface teams was a momentous process. Volunteers from different sectors, rigorously screened for physical and psychological fitness, underwent extensive training in surface operations, hazardous environment protocols, and emergency procedures. These were the pioneers, the first humans in centuries to breathe unfiltered, though still altered, outside air within protective gear, and feel natural sunlight filtered through thick visors. Their departure from the facility was a mix of solemn ceremony and quiet hope, a culmination of centuries of waiting and planning. The initial surface outposts were harsh, unforgiving environments. The landscape was scarred, the air carried strange scents, the sunlight felt different, and the silence of a world largely devoid of complex natural soundscapes was profound. The first reports from these teams, transmitted back to the underground facilities, were clinical and objective, focusing on data collection and infrastructure status. But even in the technical reports, there were glimpses of awe and trepidation. Descriptions of altered plant life, mutated but resilient, strange atmospheric phenomena, and the eerie feeling of being utterly alone on a vast, damaged planet. Within the underground facilities, the commencement of re-emergence planning and the deployment of the first surface teams brought a renewed sense of purpose and cautious optimism. The focus shifted from simply surviving underground to actively planning and working towards a future above. Education programs incorporated the real-time data and experiences from the surface teams, preparing the next waves of volunteers and the future generations for the challenges ahead. The vast archives of surface world knowledge were studied not just as history, but as blueprints and warnings for rebuilding. The process of re-emergence was understood to be a multi-generational mission. The initial surface outposts would be expanded into larger, more complex settlements, shielded and self-sufficient. Gradually, as atmospheric conditions continued to improve, or as technology advanced to mitigate the hazards, larger areas might become habitable and agriculture might be possible on the surface, possibly utilizing genetically engineered crops designed for the altered environment. The goal was not to recreate the pre-event world exactly, but to build a new civilization adapted to the changed planet. The underground facilities themselves were not expected to be immediately abandoned. They would likely serve as secure refuges, command centers, and critical infrastructure hubs for generations to come, the foundation upon which surface civilization would be rebuilt. The skills and technologies developed underground, closed-loop life support, advanced recycling, deep drilling, shielded construction, would be essential for surviving and thriving on the post-event surface. The final chapter of the story of the thousands of Americans taken to secret underground facilities was not a sudden triumphant return to a pristine world, but the beginning of a long, arduous, and uncertain journey back to the light. It was a testament to human resilience, foresight by a select few, and the capacity for adaptation across generations. The why had been answered. A catastrophic environmental event required preserving essential skills and populations in secure, hidden environments. The how involved decades of secret planning, massive engineering projects, and the creation of a network of self-sustaining underground cities. And the what next was the monumental task of reclaiming a wounded world, a mission that had just begun, carried forward by the descendants of those who had been taken underground centuries before, their lives a living bridge between a lost past and an uncertain future under a sky they were only just beginning to see.